Welcome to your deep dive all about carbon dioxide removal. Wow, you've given us quite a collection of reports and policy documents, even some serious scientific papers.
Yeah,
It looks like you really want to get to the bottom of how we can tackle climate change.
definitely.
So let's dive right in.
All right, we're going to explore this from all angles.
Yeah,
We'll be uncovering the potential of CDR, but also looking at the trade-offs and the costs,
right.
and sometimes even some unintended consequences, things you don't expect.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's all about seeing the whole picture, really understanding CDR's role in achieving our climate goals.
Okay, so let's unpack the CDR thing a bit.
Okay.
Before we jump into the specifics, can you just set the stage?
Sure.
Why is CDR such a hot topic right now? I mean, we've always known climate change is a problem, but it seems like CDR is suddenly front and center.
Well, I think it all comes down to urgency.
Okay.
2024 just became the warmest year on record.
Yeah.
It was a full 1.6 degree Kelvin hotter than pre-industrial times.
Wow.
And Europe's really feeling it more than any other continent.
Yeah, it seems like every summer sets a new heat record.
That's right. And we're not just talking about slightly warmer summers anymore.
Yeah.
We're seeing more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, wildfires, floods.
Yeah, those are some pretty scary headlines.
They are.
But I think what's really starting to hit home for people is that we're seeing the impact of those headlines.
Mm-hmm.
It's not some abstract future scenario anymore. It's happening right now.
That's exactly it. You're seeing these extreme weather events, and they're a direct threat to everything: our health, our water resources, ecosystems, food security, energy security.
Oh, wow.
They can even damage our infrastructure and threaten financial stability.
It's like a domino effect.
It is. And the longer we wait to act, the higher the risk of hitting those tipping points.
Right, those points of no return.
Exactly, which could lead to irreversible changes in our climate system.
Okay, so things are heating up, literally and figuratively.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where CDR comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's being presented as this potential solution, maybe even a game changer.
Well, CDR does have the potential to be a crucial part of the solution.
Okay.
By actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely, we're essentially trying to reverse the damage that's already been done, to limit further warming.
Okay, I get the concept, but I have to admit I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics.
Sure.
Can we just break down exactly what CDR is?
Okay.
And what types of methods are out there? Is it as simple as just planting more trees?
Well, planting trees is definitely a part of it.
Okay.
But there's a whole spectrum of CDR methods, both natural and technological.
Right.
Essentially, CDR refers to any human activity that captures CO2 from the air and stores it away for the long term.
Okay, so we're talking about capturing and storing. That's the key.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard a lot about temporary versus permanent carbon storage.
Right.
Can you explain the difference? Is it like hitting pause versus permanently deleting a file on your computer?
Ooh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So think of temporary CDR, like putting money into a savings account.
Okay.
Solutions like forests, wetlands, soil carbon sequestration, these all hold carbon for years, maybe even centuries, which is fantastic.
Right.
But it eventually cycles back into the atmosphere.
Oh, I see. So it's like hitting the pause button on those emissions.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's temporary, but what about permanent?
Permanent storage is more like investing in that retirement fund. It's locked away for good.
Got it.
Technologies like BECCS, which captures carbons from bioenergy production, and DACCS, which just sucks CO2 straight from the air.
Wow.
These offer storage that lasts for millennia or more.
Okay.
That carbon is effectively removed from the equation.
So it's like deleting the file. It's gone.
Gone.
All right, so we've got temporary solutions to buy us time and then permanent ones for long-term removal.
That's it.
But how does this fit into our overall efforts to fight climate change?
Mm-hmm.
Is CDR a replacement for cutting emissions, or is it more like a supporting actor?
That's the crucial question, and the answer is that CDR should work with emission reductions, not instead of them.
Okay, so they have to go hand in hand.
Exactly. In the near term, CDR can help us accelerate our transition to net zero emissions.
Right.
And mitigate the peak warming that we're facing.
So it's buying us some time while we work on decarbonizing our economies.
You got it.
Okay, so it helps us manage the immediate crisis, but what about the long game?
Mm-hmm.
What role does CDR play as we look towards the EU's goal of net zero by 2050 and beyond?
As we strive for net zero, CDR becomes even more important. It can help us balance out those really hard to abate emissions.
Okay.
From industries that are really difficult to decarbonize, like heavy industry, long distance transport, agriculture.
Right.
It's really difficult to completely eliminate emissions in these areas, so CDR can help bridge that gap.
So CDR is like our safety net, helping us reach net zero even if we can't eliminate every single emission?
Exactly.
And then what? Once we reach net zero, does CDR still have a role to play?
Absolutely. Beyond 2050, the goal is to achieve and sustain net negative emissions, meaning we're actually removing more CO2 from the atmosphere that we're coming in.
Okay.
This could potentially help us reverse some of the warming that's already happened and start to heal our planet.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Oh, it is.
It sounds like CDR is more than just a technological fix. It's this long-term strategy for climate recovery.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's not just planting a few trees and calling it a day.
You're right. It's more complex than that.
Yeah.
There's a whole range of CDR methods, each with their own possibilities and limitations, and we need to understand those to make good decisions.
Okay, so let's dive into the specifics.
Right.
What are some of the main CDR methods being explored right now?
Okay.
I'm curious about both the natural solutions and those high-tech solutions.
Let's start with land-based CDR, harnessing the power of nature to capture and store carbon.
Okay.
One of the most well-known methods is afforestation and reforestation,
Right.
essentially planting new trees in areas that haven't been forested in a while.
So good old-fashioned tree planting.
Yeah.
Is that really enough to make a difference? How much CO2 can a tree actually absorb?
Well, it's more impactful than you might think.
Okay.
Estimates suggest that in the EU alone, afforestation could remove between 124 and 354 megatons of CO2 per year by 2050.
Wow, megatons, that's a lot.
It is. It's like taking all the cars in Germany off the road for a year.
Okay, that's a powerful image.
Yeah.
So planting trees is a good start, but are there other ways to use nature for carbon removal?
Absolutely. We can also optimize existing forests for carbon capture through improved forest management.
Okay.
This involves things like planting a diverse mix of tree species, planning harvesting cycles really carefully, and minimizing disturbances to that forest ecosystem.
So it's about working with nature, not just planting trees randomly.
Exactly.
What about the soil beneath our feet? Can that play a role in carbon removal as well?
Soil is a massive carbon sink, and soil carbon sequestration aims to boost the amount of carbon stored in those agricultural soils.
Oh, okay.
Practices like no-till farming, planting cover crops, and adding compost, these can increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, which in turn stores more carbon.
That sounds promising.
It is.
But I've also heard concerns that soil carbon sequestration can be reversed pretty easily.
Right.
What happens if those practices are discontinued? Or if there's a drought or a flood? Could we end up releasing all that stored carbon back into the atmosphere?
You hit on a crucial point.
Yeah.
Soil carbon sequestration isn't a permanent solution, and there's always a risk of reversal.
Okay.
So it's important to implement these practices sustainably and carefully monitor soil carbon levels to make sure we're not undoing our hard work.
So it's not just about maximizing carbon storage, it's about making sure it's stored securely and for the long haul.
Exactly.
What other natural solutions are out there?
Wetland restoration is another promising avenue.
Oh, okay.
Rewetting drained peatlands and wetlands prevents CO2 from escaping into the atmosphere and can even turn them back into carbon sinks. These ecosystems are incredibly efficient at storing carbon, and restoring them can make a big difference.
I love the idea of working with nature to solve climate change.
Yeah.
It just feels like a more holistic approach than just rely on technology.
It does.
But I know there's a whole other side to CDR, those high-tech solutions that are often in the headlines.
You're thinking about technological CDR, and you're right, it's a rapidly evolving field with a lot of potential.
Yeah.
One of the most talked about technologies is BECCS, which stands for Bioenergy with Carbon Capture and Storage.
BECCS. I've heard that acronym thrown around a lot, but can you break down how it actually works?
Sure.
Is it as simple as just burning trees for energy and capturing the emissions?
It's a bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
BECCS involves growing plants, which absorb CO2 as they grow, and then using that biomass for energy production.
Okay.
The key is that the CO2 released during energy production is captured and stored permanently underground,
Right.
effectively removing it from the atmosphere.
Okay, so it's like a closed-loop system where the carbon absorbed by the plants is ultimately sequestered underground.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing it's not that simple in practice.
You're right.
What are some of the challenges with BECCS?
One of the biggest challenges is the scale of biomass needed to make a significant impact on those atmospheric CO2 levels.
Okay.
This raises concerns about land use competition.
Right.
We need to make sure that growing biomass for BECCS doesn't come at the expense of food production or biodiversity.
That's a valid concern.
It is.
It seems like we're constantly grappling with these trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
We need to address climate change, but we also need to feed a growing population and protect our ecosystems.
Exactly. And that's why careful planning and sustainable land management are so important for any kind of large-scale BECCS deployment.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make sure we're not solving one problem by creating another.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So BCCS is one of the leading technological CDR solutions, but what about DCCS?
Mm-hmm.
The technology that captured CO2 directly from the air.
Right.
Is that the silver bullet we've been waiting for?
DACCS is often seen as the holy grail of CDR because it can remove huge amounts of CO2 directly from the atmosphere
Yeah.
and store it safely away.
Okay.
However, the technology is still in its early stages, and it's currently very expensive.
So it's promising, but it needs to become more efficient and affordable to be truly viable.
Exactly.
Are there any other technological solutions on the horizon that could help us close the gap?
Absolutely. One technology that's gaining traction is biochar.
Biochar, what's that?
It's basically a charcoal-like material made from biomass,
Okay.
but instead of burning it, we add it to the soil where it can lock up carbon for centuries.
So it's like a supercharged version of soil carbon sequestration.
You got it.
That sounds pretty neat.
Yeah.
What other innovative solutions are being explored?
Another exciting area is enhanced weathering.
Enhanced weathering, okay.
The idea is to speed up a natural process where certain minerals absorb CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay.
We can do this by spreading crushed minerals on land, and they react with the CO2 and lock it away in a solid form.
So we're essentially harnessing the power of geology to fight climate change.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's still a lot we don't know about how enhanced weathering would work in practice.
You're right. It's a relatively new concept, and we need more research to understand its full potential and any possible environmental impacts.
Right.
But it's definitely a promising avenue for carbon removal.
Okay, so we've covered land-based solutions, some cutting-edge technologies. What about the ocean? Can we use that massive body of water for carbon removal?
The ocean is a huge carbon sink, and ocean-based CDR methods are being explored.
Okay.
But they're still in their early stages and come with potentially higher risks.
Okay.
One idea is ocean fertilization, where nutrients are added to stimulate phytoplankton growth,
Okay.
which absorbs CO2 through photosynthesis.
So we're basically giving the ocean a boost to help it absorb more carbon.
Exactly.
But I'm sensing a but coming here.
Well, the concern is that large-scale ocean fertilization could disrupt delicate marine ecosystems.
Right.
We have to be really cautious about unintended consequences. The ocean is so complex and interconnected.
That's a valid point. We can't just throw solutions at the problem without thinking about the downsides.
Exactly.
What other ocean-based methods are out there?
Another one being explored is ocean alkalinization, adding alkaline substances to the ocean to increase its CO2 absorption capacity.
Okay.
But again, the potential impacts on marine life need to be carefully studied before we consider large-scale deployment.
So it sounds like we've got a lot of options on the table, from natural solutions to cutting-edge technologies to even using the power of the ocean.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to CDR.
Right.
What are some of the challenges and trade-offs we need to be aware of?
That's a great question, and it leads us into a crucial part of the CDR conversation.
Okay.
We need to be realistic about the potential downsides, as well as the ethical and governance considerations.
Right.
Because even with the best intentions, large-scale CDR deployment could have unintended consequences.
That sounds like a perfect segue to the next part of our deep dive.
It is.
Let's dig into the complexities of CDR and explore those potential downsides.
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we've seen this incredible array of CDR methods, from planting trees to literally pulling CO2 out of the air.
It's amazing what's possible now.
It is, but you mentioned some potential downsides.
Right.
What are the big concerns?
Well, one of the biggest worries is what's called mitigation deterrence.
Mitigation deterrence.
Yeah, it's the risk that focusing on CDR might make us complacent about cutting emissions.
Oh, I see. So it's like we think, oh, well, we've got CDR. We don't have to worry about reducing our emissions so much.
That's the worry. We can't just assume technology will magically clean up our mess and keep emitting like there's no tomorrow.
Right. It's like that classic, I'll just eat whatever I want because I'm going to work out later mentality.
Exactly.
Not exactly a recipe for success.
Nope.
Whether we're talking about our waistlines or the planet.
Exactly. CDR should be a tool to complement really deep cuts in emissions.
Okay.
Not replace them.
So it has to go hand in hand.
Yeah, we need to do both, and we need to do them now.
Urgency is key.
Absolutely. We can't just kick the can down the road and hope that CDR will save the day.
Right. But even if we're making progress on those emission cuts, there are still those hard-to-abate sectors like heavy industry and long-distance transport. Is CDR the answer there?
Well, it could be a valuable tool there, but even then, we need to be cautious.
Okay, how so?
Defining what is hard to abate is tricky.
Really?
Yeah. Different countries and organizations have different definitions.
Oh, I see.
And this can lead to some inconsistencies and loopholes.
So we need to be on the same page about what we're trying to achieve with CDR in these sectors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even if we agree on which sectors are truly hard to abate, how do we make sure that CDR is actually helping us meet our climate goals?
Right.
And not just being used as a band-aid for continued emissions?
Well, that's where the concept of a greenhouse gas budget comes in.
Greenhouse gas budget?
Yeah, it's basically a limit, a finite amount of emissions we can't exceed if we want to meet those climate goals.
So it's like a carbon credit card with a strict limit.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
We can spend it now on those hard-to-abate emissions, but we'll need to use CDR to pay off that debt later on.
We're going to have to pay the piper eventually.
Exactly. We only have a certain amount of carbon we can spend
Right.
before we buff our climate budget.
And that means we need to decide how much we're willing to emit now and how much we'll need to remove later.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
Sounds like some tough choices.
They are.
But how do we actually make those decisions? How do we translate this carbon budget into actual policies and actions?
Well, there are two main approaches that are being discussed.
Okay.
One is a target-led approach,
Okay.
where we set really specific targets for both emission reductions and CDR.
So we're basically drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah.
And saying this is how much we're allowed to emit and this is how much we need to remove.
Exactly. No ifs, ands, or buts.
This approach seems pretty straightforward.
It provides really clear direction and helps minimize that risk of mitigation deterrence we talked about.
Right. We don't want to slip back into bad habits.
Exactly.
But are there any downsides to this top-down approach?
Well, it can be a little less flexible
Okay.
and might not always be the most cost-effective way to do things.
How so?
Well, for example, it might be cheaper to achieve the same level of emission reduction through a combination of different approaches,
Right.
rather than strictly sticking to these very specific targets.
So it's a trade-off, clarity versus flexibility.
Exactly.
What's the other approach?
The other one is a price-led approach, using things like carbon pricing
Okay.
to incentivize both emissions reductions and CDR.
So we're putting a price tag on carbon.
Making it more expensive to pollute and rewarding those who are removing it.
So basically, we're letting the market decide how best to meet our climate goals.
Yeah, if it's cheaper to reduce emissions than to pay for carbon removal, companies will be encouraged to choose the cleaner option.
Right. It makes sense economically.
Exactly. And this approach can be more flexible and potentially even more cost-effective over the long term.
Okay.
But it also carries a greater rate of that mitigation deterrence if the price isn't high enough to actually incentivize action.
So it's a balancing act.
It is.
We need to set a price that's high enough to drive change, but not so high that it hurts the economy.
Exactly.
And then there's the question of how we actually track and measure the carbon being removed.
Right.
We need to make sure we're getting good data right.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, how do we know if these CDR projects are actually working?
You're absolutely right. Robust monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, or MRV, are essential.
MRV, okay.
We need to be able to track how much carbon is removed, where it's being stored, and for how long.
It sounds pretty complicated.
It is.
Especially when we're talking about different types of CDR, like temporary natural solutions versus permanent technological ones.
You hit the nail on the head. The complexity of MRV is one of the biggest challenges facing the CDR sector.
Really?
Yeah, we need systems that can accurately quantify the amount of carbon removed for each method, track where it's stored, and ensure it stays there for as long as it needs to.
So a one-size-fits-all approach to MRV isn't going to work.
Nope, we need specialized systems that are tailored to each specific CDR method.
Makes sense. And it gets even more complicated with temporary CDR methods,
Right.
where that risk of reversal is always present.
Exactly, like if there's a forest fire and it releases the carbon stored in trees, we need to be able to account for that and adjust our calculations.
Wow, so MRV needs to be dynamic and adaptable.
It does. It needs to account for the uncertainties of the natural world.
Right, it's not just a snapshot in time, it's ongoing monitoring and adjustment.
Exactly.
And it needs to be transparent and rigorous, right?
Absolutely. We need to be able to show that these methods are delivering the carbon removal they promise and that the data is reliable.
So we can build trust and confidence in CDR.
Exactly.
This all makes sense from a scientific perspective, but I'm curious about what people think about CDR. Is there a sense that it's a viable solution, or is there skepticism and resistance?
Well, public perception is absolutely crucial for CDR, and it's an area where we need to do a lot more work.
Okay.
Awareness of CDR is still pretty low in the EU.
Really?
Yeah, and a lot of people just haven't really formed an opinion about it yet.
So it's a blank slate, an opportunity to shape public opinion and build support.
It is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge.
How so?
There's a risk that as people become more aware of CDR, concerns about potential risks and those unintended consequences will also grow.
Yeah, I can see that.
Some people might see it as a distraction from cutting emissions, while others might worry about the impacts on ecosystems or communities.
It's understandable that people would be hesitant. This is a new and complex field.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a fear of the unknown, especially when we're talking about potentially big changes to our natural systems.
That's exactly why clear communication and public engagement are so important.
Right. We need to be upfront and honest.
We do. We need to have those open conversations about the potential benefits and risks, involve people in the decision-making, and address their concerns in a transparent way.
So building trust and transparency is really important.
Absolutely. It's not just about the technology and science. It's about the social and ethical considerations, too.
And that trust is also important for getting people to invest in this, right?
Exactly. It's essential for attracting investment and ensuring that CDR is done responsibly.
Speaking of investment, that brings us to another question. Who's going to pay for all of this?
Right.
Scaling up CDR to the level we need is going to take a lot of money.
You're not wrong. It won't be cheap.
So who should foot the bill? Should it be governments, the private sector, or maybe some kind of partnership?
It's likely going to be a combination of all of the above. Governments will need to support research and development, create incentives for CDR, and establish really clear regulations.
So basically set the stock for private investment to flow in.
Exactly.
What are some of the specific ways we could finance CDR?
Well, there are a few options. Public funding can provide grants and subsidies for research and pilot projects.
Mm-hmm.
Carbon markets can create financial incentives for companies to invest in CDR projects that generate carbon credits.
Right.
And then there are tax incentives that can encourage private companies to get involved.
I'm starting to see why there's so much talk about including CDR in the EU emissions trading system.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a logical way to encourage investment.
It's definitely promising. The EU ETS is already a well-established system.
Yeah.
Putting a price on carbon and incorporating CDR could create a financial reason for companies to invest in carbon removal projects.
Rather than just paying for their emissions.
Exactly.
But I imagine it's not as simple as just adding CDR into the existing system.
You're right. There are a lot of things to consider.
Like what?
Well, things like ensuring environmental integrity, preventing market distortions, managing the challenges of temporary CDR.
Right. We don't want to create any loopholes.
Exactly. We need to make sure the system is robust, transparent, and doesn't accidentally undermine our climate goals.
It sounds like we could do a whole other deep dive just on carbon markets and CDR.
We could.
But for now, it's clear that finding the right financial mechanisms and policies is key.
Absolutely. It's all part of creating the right environment for CDR to be successful, and that goes beyond just the science and technology.
Right. It's about policy, economics, public perception, even ethics.
It all plays a role.
Wow, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
It's fascinating, but also kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
But we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The science, the potential benefits and risks, the policy, the economics, even public perception.
We have, but there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle.
Oh, okay. What's that?
The ultimate goal, achieving and sustaining net negative emissions.
Ah, yes. The idea of actually reversing the warming trend. That's a big one. Is it even possible? And what would it take to get there?
That's the question, and it leads us into the final part of our deep dive.
So we've talked about the urgency of climate action and all the different ways that we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
We've even gotten into the nitty-gritty of the policies and economics.
It's a complicated landscape.
It is, but now it's time to talk about the big goal, net negative emissions. Is this just a dream, or can we actually make this happen?
It's definitely ambitious, but not impossible.
Okay.
Remember, net negative emissions means removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than we're putting in.
Right, so we're not just slowing down climate change, we're actually reversing it.
Exactly.
That's incredible. So where do we even begin? How do we wrap our heads around this?
Well, first we have to understand the scale of what we're talking about.
Okay.
To achieve net negative emissions, we need to use CDR on a massive scale.
Okay, how massive are we talking?
Think billions of tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere every year.
Billions of tons. That's almost unimaginable.
It's a huge undertaking.
Can we even do that with the technology that we have available right now?
That's the big question. Right now, permanent CDR methods like BECCS and DACCS, they're expensive and they use a lot of energy.
Yeah.
But the good news is research is moving really fast.
Okay, that's good.
Scientists are developing new technologies, improving the efficiency of existing ones, and finding ways to bring those costs down.
So there's hope for the future.
There is.
But even if we figure out how to scale up CDR to that level, wouldn't it take a huge amount of land and energy and resources?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are we talking about turning the entire planet into this giant carbon removal machine?
Well, that's a valid concern, and that's why we need to be smart about how we do this.
Okay.
It's not just about maximizing carbon removal no matter the cost. We have to think about those potential impacts.
Right, the environmental and social impacts.
Exactly. Things like protecting biodiversity, ensuring we have enough food and water.
We can't solve one problem by creating another. So what are some of the strategies to do this in a way that's sustainable?
Well, one key area is optimizing the CDR methods that we already have.
Okay.
For example, researchers are finding ways to improve the efficiency of BECCS to get more biomass while minimizing land use.
So it's about making the most of what we already have.
Exactly. And with DACCS, there's a lot of interesting research going on there, too.
Oh, like what?
Scientists are developing next-generation DACCS technologies that use less energy and capture CO2 more effectively.
Okay.
And there's also a lot of interest in modular DACCS systems.
Modular.
Yeah, instead of these giant centralized plants, you could have smaller DACCS units that operate in different locations.
Oh, I see. That makes it seem more manageable somehow.
Right. And then beyond optimizing what we have, there's also a lot of excitement about exploring completely new CDR approaches.
Like what?
Well-enhanced weathering is one that's getting a lot of attention.
Right. We talked about that earlier, spreading those crushed minerals to absorb CO2.
Mm-hmm.
It sounded promising, but also kind of experimental. Could it really be done on a large scale?
It's still early, but the research suggests that enhanced weathering could be a viable option.
Okay.
Of course, we need to carefully assess the potential risks and benefits.
Right. Make sure it's not going to harm the soil or water or biodiversity.
Exactly. With any CDR method, we need to make more that we're not doing more harm than good.
It seems like every solution has its own set of challenges.
It does.
So is it just a matter of choosing the least bad option?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
It's about weighing the potential benefits and risks and making smart decisions based on the science.
Mm-hmm.
And also recognizing that different approaches will work better in different situations.
Right, right. So maybe we need a bunch of different approaches working together.
Exactly. A portfolio of CDR methods to achieve those net negative goals.
A portfolio approach, I like that. Spread the risk, explore different options, and see what works best.
Exactly.
But even with all this amazing technology and these strategies, the cost is still a big issue. Who's going to pay for all of this?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Financing net negative emissions is a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
It's going to require a lot of investment from both the public and private sectors and some creative financial thinking.
So we're talking about governments, businesses, investors. Everyone needs to be on board.
Exactly. We'll need public funding, carbon markets, private investment, and we'll need to come up with some new approaches.
Like what?
Things like carbon removal bonds to get the money flowing.
Carbon removal bonds, what are those?
They're basically a way for governments or other institutions to raise money specifically for CDR projects.
Okay.
Investors buy these bonds, and that provides the funding up front, and then they get a return on their investment based on how much CO2 is removed.
So it's like investing in the future of the planet.
Exactly.
That's a pretty cool idea.
It is. But there are challenges, of course.
Like what?
Well, we need those strong MRV systems to track and verify the carbon removal.
Right, right.
And we have to make sure that these bonds are financially stable over the long term.
So it's about building a whole new financial system around CDR.
Exactly.
That's a lot of work.
It is, but the challenges of CDR are matched by the potential rewards.
Yeah.
If we can make this happen, it would be a game changer.
Totally. So achieving these net negative emissions would really be something special.
It would prove our commitment to tackling this problem and show that we can use our ingenuity to make a difference.
It's about more than just reducing emissions. It's about restoring our planet.
Mm-hmm. And leaving a healthy planet for future generations.
And it's really exciting to think that CDR could play such an important role in that.
It is, and it's important to remember that informed citizens like you are essential to making all of this happen.
Really?
Yeah, by staying informed and engaged and asking those tough questions, we can hold our leaders accountable and help steer the world in the right direction.
So there you have it, your deep dive into the world of carbon dioxide removal.
We've explored it all, the science, the challenges, the opportunities, the sheer scale of what we need to do.
We've gone from forests to factories, from the soil to the sea, and even into the world of finance and policy.
Hopefully you now have a better understanding of this amazing tool of our fight against climate change.
CDR isn't a magic bullet, but it is a powerful tool, and if we use it responsibly along with cutting our emissions, we can create a better future.
A healthier and more sustainable future.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that the future isn't something that just happens to us.
It's something that we create together.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into carbon dioxide removal.
And thank you for listening to The Deep Dive.